The hum of the fluorescent light above my desk was the only sound left in the office that night. Everyone else had gone home hours earlier, leaving the hallways dark and the elevators idle. It was just me, a stack of case files taller than a briefcase, and the kind of silence that presses against your chest like a weight. I leaned back in my chair, eyes scanning the framed verdicts on the wall, each one a reminder of battles fought and won. 50 major cases. 50 times I had stood in front of a judge and jury and delivered the kind of precision arguments that turned the tide. Lives changed, fortunes saved, a company shielded, and not once did the applause linger past the boardroom door. Victory is quiet when it belongs to someone else. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 54 years old, and until 3 nights ago, I was senior litigation counsel at Grayson & Holt, one of the largest corporate firms in the state. 30 years in the same trenches, carrying their weight, turning legal minefields into paved roads. My fingerprints were on every major defense they'd mounted in the last decade. If you drank their champagne, it was poured into glasses I paid for, with my sweat. That's why the meeting still burns in my memory, like a brand pressed to skin. The boardroom was glass-walled and cold, overlooking the city skyline that glittered like a lie. She sat at the head of the table. Emily Cross, 25 years old, freshly minted CEO. Her father's fortune bought her the chair. Her Instagram bought her the audience. She leaned forward, fingers steepled, and smiled like someone about to deliver mercy. "Daniel," she said, drawing my name out like she was tasting it. "We appreciate everything you've done. Truly. But the truth is, you're just not modern enough for where we're taking this firm." I didn't blink. Not modern enough. 30 years of precedent, strategy, blood on the courtroom floor, and she reduced it to a hashtag. Her replacement for me was already waiting outside, a kid no older than my nephew, hair-styled like he belonged in a band, not a courtroom. His credentials? He ran a popular channel where he explained law in memes and quick cuts. She brought him in, introduced him as if he were a savior. His first words to me, grinning like an idiot: "Honestly, facts don't matter as much as confidence. People just want a good story." I remember placing my hands on the table, steady, deliberate, no argument, no defense. I simply nodded once, collected my pen, and slid it into the breast pocket of my suit. Emily tilted her head, waiting for me to protest, to beg for relevance. But silence is a sharper weapon than any word. I packed my briefcase that evening in front of a dozen younger associates who watched with the curiosity of children seeing their grandfather dismantle a watch. Some looked guilty, others relieved. None spoke. I walked out of Grayson & Holt for the last time without raising my voice. But leaving quietly is not the same as leaving defeated. The truth is, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A slow burn in my chest. A focus that sharpened the edges of the world around me. Their mistake wasn't in firing me. Their mistake was in thinking I'd stop being what I am, just because they no longer paid me to be. When I stepped out into the night, the city air hit cold against my face. I could still hear Emily's voice in my ears, lilting, dismissive, careless. Not modern enough. I thought of every client I'd saved from ruin, every cross-examination that broke a liar in half, every victory I'd handed to this company like pearls, dropped into their hands. I thought of the boy they'd hired, grinning, proclaiming that facts didn't matter. And I smiled. 3 days. That's all it ever takes. I replayed her words in my head like a closing argument I was dismantling piece by piece. You're not modern enough. She had said it with the confidence of someone who thought style could outweigh substance, that buzzwords could silence hard truth. I didn't hear it with anger. I heard it the way I've always heard testimony. Measured, dissected, stripped of its perfume, until the bones showed. Every syllable was arrogance wrapped in ignorance. That kind of voice always leaves a trail. The first night I sat in my home office, the city outside a blur of neon, the house too quiet, without the pressure of deadlines. I powered on my laptop and pulled up the databases I had maintained over the years, case notes, industry contacts, legal filings that never made it to public record. Old habits returned like muscle memory. I wasn't Daniel Mercer, the discarded relic of Grayson and Holt. I was Daniel Mercer, litigator, predator, man who lived in the shadows between evidence and exposure. I started simple. Her speeches were all online, packaged into glossy reels for shareholders and followers who liked the sound of disruption more than the reality of it. I transcribed them, looking not at what she said, but what she avoided. There were gaps where hard numbers should have been, promises wrapped in vague gestures, slides filled with phrases that carried no weight in a courtroom. That alone was smoke, but I needed fire. Contracts came next. I still had access to archived agreements I'd drafted years before, and though my official clearance was revoked, I knew exactly where the skeletons tended to be buried. I filed quiet requests through public channels, pretending to be a curious consultant. Most clerks never question a seasoned attorney asking for records. My name still carried that weight. By midnight, I had 3 contracts that had Emily's signature on them. They were amendments, drafted under the guise of modernization. But I saw the seams immediately. Clauses struck without justification. Payments rerouted through shell vendors that didn't exist 5 years ago. On paper, it looked like streamlined efficiency. To anyone trained in litigation, it looked like laundering. I leaned back in my chair, the glow of the screen painting my face in blue. I thought of her replacement. Smiling kid, saying facts don't matter. That was exactly the kind of arrogance that makes people sloppy. I kept digging. Tax records cross-referenced against vendor filings. I traced addresses that led to empty buildings, mail drops in offshore havens, companies incorporated with 1 employee and no product. It was all dressed up as strategic partnerships. In truth, it was a carousel of money moving in circles. The hours bled together. The silence of my office filled with the sound of keys, pages flipping, the occasional scratch of my pen against a notepad. I wasn't chasing anger. I was chasing truth, the way a hunter follows tracks in fresh snow. Every detail sharpened as I pieced together the puzzle. Emily Cross had built her throne on sand, and the tide was already creeping in. By 3 a.m., I had what I needed, a memo buried in a shareholder disclosure, signed off by her directly. It reclassified revenue from untested products as secured assets to inflate quarterly earnings. Fraud disguised as innovation. A clever trick, but not clever enough. I printed it, held the page in my hands, and felt the weight of it settle. I didn't rush to act. I didn't pick up the phone or send an anonymous tip. That's not how you dismantle an empire. You don't swing the hammer after the first crack. You let the foundation rot until the whole structure collapses under its own deception. I slid the papers into a folder, locked it in the drawer beside my desk, and sat in silence. The case wasn't ready, but the ammunition was loaded. All that was left was to choose the right moment to pull the trigger. Preparation is a quiet art. People imagine war rooms, shouting commanders, maps covered in pins. The truth is simpler. Preparation happens in silence, in the scratch of a pen, the weight of a phone call answered on the second ring, the pause before someone agrees to a favor they thought they'd never owe. I sat at my desk and laid out each move like pieces on a board, deliberate, inevitable, not a single detail left to chance. The first calls were to men and women who had seen me at work when reputations were hanging by a thread. A clerk in the county recorder's office who once slipped me documents after hours when the judge's gavel was breathing down my neck. An investigator whose testimony I had shielded from a ruthless cross-examination that could have destroyed his career. A judge, long retired, who owed his peace of mind to a case I handled with enough discretion to keep his name out of the papers. None of them asked for explanations. My name was explanation enough. They knew if I was reaching out, something had already begun to burn. From each one, I collected a piece, records that would otherwise take months to obtain, confirmation of filings routed through unfamiliar channels, an introduction to someone inside the oversight committee who could be persuaded to read between the lines. Nothing illegal, nothing reckless, just the kind of shortcuts only earned after decades of leaving favors buried like coins in the ground. And now I was digging them up. At the same time, I tracked her. Emily Cross was everywhere. News panels, glossy magazines, gala dinners. She leaned into the camera with that manufactured ease, all sharp cheekbones and sound bites about disruption. Investors ate it up. Crowds cheered. She was the face of progress, the avatar of modernity. But every smile was another opportunity, every appearance another timestamp. The louder she performed, the more obvious her patterns became. I mapped her schedule against the documents I'd gathered. When the quarterly filings dropped, I'd already aligned them with the offshore accounts. When she announced a new partnership, I cross-referenced it with shell corporations that had no offices, no employees, just a name on a registry in a country known for secrecy. I let her build her empire higher, brick by fraudulent brick, because the taller it rose, the harder it would fall. Every night I refined the plan. Where to leak first? Trade journalists with sharp instincts but cautious hands. Then the oversight committee, primed by whispers of inconsistencies. Finally, the courtroom, where the facade of innovation would be stripped to bone and marrow. Timing was everything. If I moved too early, she'd spin it as sabotage. Too late, and the rot might be buried beneath fresh paint. The trick was to let her arrogance lead her deeper into the trap. I watched one of her press conferences from my living room, the television volume low, her voice echoing off the walls. She was unveiling some initiative about digital justice, her words soaring, abstract, utterly detached from substance. The crowd clapped on cue, dazzled by her rhythm. I wrote notes as if cross-examining a hostile witness. Every boast, every vague promise. Another rope for her to hang herself. While she basked in the spotlight, I pulled threads in the dark. A former client of mine, wronged by a deal that her father's company once orchestrated, provided me with boxes of correspondence, emails, drafts, contracts that tied into the very loopholes she was now exploiting. A young associate, disillusioned after being brushed aside in favor of her influencer-turned-counsel, quietly slipped me an internal memo. Piece by piece, the puzzle was forming. It wasn't enough to prove incompetence. It was enough to prove deliberate deception. 3 nights later, I dressed in a plain suit and walked into the back of a crowded auditorium. She was on stage, framed by blue light, and a banner that read, Vision 2030. She spoke like a prophet, promising revolutions in law and commerce, her hands sweeping through the air as if she could pull the future down with her fingertips. The audience leaned forward, hanging on every word. I sat in the shadows, silent, still, watching her paint the room with illusions. She believed she was untouchable, that her youth and her bravado would shield her from consequence. She believed she was winning. She had no idea I was already holding the match. It started with a whisper, a column in a trade journal read by the kind of people who notice numbers before headlines. Just a suggestion of irregularities, nothing more than smoke on the horizon. But markets are allergic to smoke. By midday, calls buzzed through investor circles, and the steady climb of Grayson and Holt's stock charted a jagged line downward. Emily Cross appeared on camera that evening, her smile rehearsed, her tone dismissive. "This is nothing more than old guard sabotage," she said, laughing lightly as if the accusation itself were beneath her. To the untrained ear, she sounded confident. To mine, she sounded like a witness who'd just realized the jury wasn't buying the story. I didn't push further. I didn't need to. Once the seed of doubt takes root, it grows on its own. The regulators followed the money because they had to, their offices flooded with questions from reporters who smelled blood. Each filing they pulled matched the cracks I'd already mapped. Shell companies with hollow addresses, revenue reclassified into air, all dressed in language sleek enough to slip past casual inspection, but brittle under the weight of scrutiny. I watched them chase the trail I'd laid out, each new revelation arriving like a beat in music I'd already composed. Emily didn't retreat. She doubled down. A press release the next morning declared the firm stronger than ever, championing modern practices and innovative reporting standards. She framed critics as relics, desperate to drag her vision back into the mud of yesterday. Her allies clapped. The market did not. Every word she spoke dug the hole deeper, every denial a brick stacked higher on the pyre. I remained silent. My hands rested steady on the wheel as the car drifted toward the cliff. It wasn't enough for her to fall. She needed to fall in full view, her arrogance preserved for record. So, I let her speak. I let her parade her confidence while investors peeled away, while clients whispered to competitors, while oversight committees drafted letters demanding answers. I sat in my office at home, screens glowing with feeds of her unraveling. She was still smiling, but her eyes told the truth. Panic, sharp and jagged, gnawed beneath the surface. The first resignation came from a senior partner who had once toasted me with whiskey after a major verdict. His statement was careful, polite, but the message was clear. He would not sink with the ship. More followed. Associates fled. Consultants scrubbed their names from the website. Emily stood firm, alone at the podium, voice growing shrill. "These accusations are baseless. We are the future of law." But the future she promised was already ash. I imagined the boardroom I once sat in, the glass walls now fogged with fear. She probably paced the length of it, snapping at underlings, demanding loyalty. But loyalty is currency, and hers had no value left. I didn't need to raise my voice or step into the light. Her empire was devouring itself, one denial at a time. Still, I held back the final strike. The documents in my drawer, the memos, the cross-referenced contracts, they stayed sealed. Timing mattered more than proof. If I unleashed it too soon, she could spin it. If I waited just long enough, the court would not see rumor or speculation. They would see inevitability. I poured myself a drink as the news cycle replayed her latest defense. She looked smaller on screen now, dwarfed by the weight of her own performance. A leader collapsing under lights too bright for her shoulders. My pulse didn't rise. My hands didn't shake. This was what I had prepared for. Years of arguments honed my patience sharper than any blade. "Tomorrow morning, the court convenes, and I will be there." The courtroom was already full when I stepped through the doors, the sound of murmured voices rising like the low growl of a storm. Reporters packed the benches, pens poised, cameras clicking despite the bailiff's warnings. Investors filled the back rows, their polished shoes tapping against the floor with nervous rhythm. At the front, Emily Cross sat beside her counsel, eyes forward, chin lifted higher than her confidence could carry. She wore a pale suit, carefully chosen to suggest poise, innocence, leadership. It was theater, but I'd been in enough trials to know the ending before the curtains ever rose. The judge entered, the room rose, and just like that, the silence of law pressed down over us all. My briefcase rested at my feet, heavy with files that had been sharpened into weapons over weeks of patient preparation. When my name was called, I stood, shoulders squared, voice calm but honed. I didn't raise it. I didn't need to. The truth carries its own weight. The evidence unfolded piece by piece, each exhibit another fracture in her glass tower. Bank records rerouted through foreign accounts, contracts altered with a pen stroke meant to disguise millions siphoned off as innovative investments. Emails that dressed deception as strategy, her own words betraying her. Each document I laid before the court was met with the scrape of pens, the shifting of bodies leaning forward to catch every word. It wasn't the thunder of revelation that shook the room. It was the inevitability. Then came the witnesses, clerks who admitted the numbers never added up, associates who revealed that memos were rewritten at her command. One by one, they aligned like dominoes, each fall driving the next, each word slicing through the polished image she had built. And finally, her new star hire, the young man who once told me facts didn't matter. He took the stand with a smile still clinging to his face, but under cross-examination the mask cracked. His jargon collapsed under pressure, his answers tripped over each other, and when pressed for evidence to back his sweeping claims, he stammered until the courtroom filled with an embarrassed silence. By the time he admitted he had no real legal experience beyond commentary, his voice was barely more than a whisper. I watched Emily then. For the first time since this began, her poise faltered. She leaned toward him, whispered sharply, eyes darting toward the judge. Panic, unpolished and raw, slid across her expression, like oil rising to the surface of water. I didn't need to look at the jury. I knew. The decision had already settled in their minds. When I spoke my closing words, I delivered them with precision, each phrase cutting clean through her last defenses. This was not modernization. This was not disruption. This was fraud, plain and deliberate, designed to deceive those who trusted her. Innovation does not mean breaking the law. Progress does not mean robbing the very people you claim to lead. And arrogance does not absolve guilt. My voice did not waver. It did not need to rise. The silence after each sentence was enough. The judge leaned forward, expression grim, and the gavel fell once, echoing through the chamber like a final heartbeat. Fraud confirmed, assets seized, positions vacated effective immediately. That was it. Years of posturing, undone in a single verdict. Emily sat frozen, lips parted, her empire collapsing faster than she could draw breath. Her friend buried his face in his hands. Careers weren't just bruised, they were annihilated. I gathered my briefcase and walked out as the room erupted. Reporters shouted questions, flashes burst like lightning, voices rose in a cacophony of judgment and triumph. I didn't answer. I didn't linger. The sun met me on the courthouse steps, warm and unflinching. I paused for a moment, breathing it in, the noise behind me fading to a dull roar. Betrayal isn't new. Arrogance isn't new. It wears new clothes, new language, new disguises. but it always falls the same way. I've seen it in courtrooms where the truth was stripped bare, in boardrooms where power masqueraded as vision, and on battlefields where confidence collapsed into dust. And I'll see it again. Because the silence before judgment, that moment when the guilty still believe they're safe, that silence has always belonged to me.